Assalamu alaikum everyone. Hope you are doing well. So in today's class, I'll explain you really important concept of macroeconomics, AS level, and this is from fiscal policy, and the subtopic is cyclical and structural budget deficit. I'll explain you the basic definitions, basic description of these concepts, and then we will move on to the graphical representation of these concepts. Although this is really confusing, but I'll try to make it systematic and easier for you so that you understand it in true sense and you can reproduce this concept if it is tested in the examination as well. So let's move on to the computer screen and begin the video. Okay, everyone, so this is the video relevant to cyclical and structural budget deficit. That is really confusing concept, and I'll try to make it as simple as possible for you. And this topic is from unit number 5 and chapter number 22, chapter 22 of AS economics, right? So if you want to look into the details from the textbook, then it is also explained in activity 22.2 in the Cambridge textbook 4th edition. Okay, so now let me make it simple to you. Cyclical budget deficits. First of all, if we define what budget is the total summary of income and expenditure of the government, right? And budget is divided into three further types. One is called surplus budget, and second one is deficit budget, and the third one is equilibrium budget. So focus on my voice instead of writing might be not that much clear to you. So budget is again the summary of income and expenditure of the government. Surplus budget is when government income is more than government expenditure, like tax is more than or greater than government expenditure. I'm using T for tax and G for government expenditure. And deficit budget is when tax revenue is lesser than government spending. And of course, when tax revenue is equal to government spending, that is called balanced budget or equilibrium budget. Okay, so this is the basic idea of budget and different types of budgets that we generally basically study in fiscal policy unit number 5 and chapter number 22. Okay, so now moving to these specific terms, cyclical and structural budget deficit. Cyclical budget, keep in mind, is the budget deficit that is caused because of fall in economic activity or due to the economic recession in the country and rise in unemployment in the country. So cyclical deficit is caused by fall in aggregate demand, and it is caused by recession in the economy, and it is caused by higher unemployment. Although all of these three things basically mean the same thing, but I'm writing all these three components of cyclical budget deficit. Keep in mind, जब इकोनॉमी फुल एम्प्लॉयमेंट में होती है तो cyclical budget deficit हमारे पास ज़ीरो हो जाता है. So when economy is at full employment, cyclical budget deficit will be zero. But structural, so cyclical deficit is not a source of concern for the government because it automatically is removed when economic activity increases, aggregate demand increases, economy comes out of recession and employment starts rising. But the structural deficit is a source of concern, and it is caused when government spends more than its expenditure, and this can be unplanned expenditure as well. Structural deficit, for example, if there is any kind of natural disaster in the country and government has to spend more, then government expenditure will suddenly increase and it will cause structural deficit. Structural deficit is a source of concern because it is not automatically corrected, right? It prevails for longer time. जिस टाइम पे cyclical budget deficit हमारे पास ज़ीरो होता है, structural budget deficit उस टाइम पे भी exist कर रहा होता है. कुछ ना कुछ deficit फिर भी exist करेगा when economy is at full employment and cyclical budget is zero. अच्छा, ये concepts आपको, और definitely अगर दोनों exist करते हैं, cyclical deficit भी exist करता है और structural भी exist करता है, तो total budget deficit जो होगा, total budget deficit will be equal to cyclical deficit plus structural deficit. ठीक है. So ये चीज़ आप ज़हन में रखें. लेकिन अगर cyclical deficit 0 होगा then definitely structural deficit will exist in the economy and it happens in case of full employment. अब इसकी जो ग्राफ है, ये ग्राफ काफ़ी कंफ्यूज करता है बच्चों को. सो लेट मी मेक यू क्लियर दिस ग्राफ. और ग्राफ लुक्स लाइक दिस. सो आप उसमें टेक्स्ट बुक में भी जाएंगे तो आपको मिलेगा, लेकिन मैं थोड़ी सी इसकी लेबलिंग ईजी कर दूंगा एग्ज़ाम में. उसमें कैम्ब्रिज की टेक्स्ट बुक में थोड़ा सा इसको कॉम्प्लिकेट किया हुआ. सो वी हैव बजट ऑन पोजीशन ऑफ बजट ऑन वाई एक्सिस. This negative area is deficit and this 0 point is basically, this is 0, yeah, origin point where budget deficit is 0. Like it is balanced budget, there is neither like deficit nor surplus. But when we move to the positive region, this is called like surplus budget. And on X we have real GDP, so we will write real GDP here. And I'm drawing a line like that is basically cyclical budget. This is cyclical budget. In Cambridge book it is mentioned as XX. So this is basically budget, line for budget. Keep in mind, as I told you earlier, that when cyclical budget is 0, economy is at full employment. So it means this is the point of full employment. So this is, let's say, YEF, full employment. I'm using it for full employment. So when economy is at full employment, that is YFE, budget is 0, mean there is no deficit, rather budget is balanced. Okay, so as I told you earlier that if there is full employment in the economy, there may be some structural budget deficit prevailing in the economy, and it means that we have to draw another line here that will show like structural budget. And at full employment you can see that there is some structural budget deficit because we are in the negative region. This is negative region. When we move to the negative region, this is called deficit. So this point from YFE to, let's say, point A, this gap represents structural budget deficit, right? So this is structural budget deficit. Okay, now moving to, but there is no cyclical budget deficit at this point, because when economy is at full employment, cyclical budget deficit is 0. Now moving to the like economic condition, that is recession in the country. When recession occurs, economy will move from YFE to Y1, let's assume. Now unemployment will rise and economic recession will be caused. But at Y1, when we draw the perpendicular, we see that there is some cyclical deficit now from Y1 to, let's say, this is Y2. This gap Y1, Y2 represents cyclical deficit. And if we further extend this perpendicular to structural deficit budget, basically structural budget line, then this part is structural deficit. So Y3, for example, we label it Y3. So the total budget deficit is from Y1 to Y3. Like total budget deficit is equal to Y1 to Y3 when like employment is at Y1 or real GDP is equal to Y1. On the other hand, this is basically the sum of two kinds of deficits. One is like from Y1 to Y2, this deficit is cyclical deficit. So cyclical deficit is equal to Y1, Y2, and this part is from Y1 to Y2 to Y3. This is basically structural budget deficit. Okay, so if we add these two values, then the total deficit will be equal to Y1 to Y3, and this is from Y1 to Y3. This is the total budget deficit, out of which this much is cyclical and this much is structural. I believe you got this idea, and I have another alternative explanation for this as well. And if we look into that, Then we can make another graph for that, where we show taxes and government expenditure. Government expenditure at a given time are fixed, so you can show government expenditure like this. And again we have real GDP on X, this is real GDP, and on Y we have taxes and government spending. Okay, so this is government expenditure and this is like tax, right? So when tax and government expenditure both are equal, then it is basically the point where there is like balanced budget. When tax is equal to government expenditure, it is called balanced budget or equilibrium budget as well. So we assume that this is the point of full employment. When there is full employment, there will be no cyclical deficit, right? When economy operates at full employment, cyclical deficit is 0. And now if government has to spend more income, like due to some reasons, as I told you earlier, there may be like floods, there may be earthquakes, there may be any kind of natural disaster, or there may be any kind of mismanagement at the part of the government. So government will have to spend more, or in type of elections, times of elections, definitely again government spending increases. So government expenditure will move upward. If economy remains at full employment, then now government expenditure have gone up and taxes are low, then this is basically again causing deficit, and this is kind of structural budget deficit, right? So this perpendicular from A to B represents structural budget deficit, but there is no cyclical budget, because at full employment level cyclical budget deficit is 0. Okay, so I believe this concept makes sense for you, and if there is any confusion, you may write in the comment box and I'll get back to you as early as possible. So see you with the next video soon. Bye bye.